The date was January 24th, 1925. The snow crunched under Johnny Torrio's feet as he stepped out of his Cadillac on South Clyde Avenue in Chicago. The 42-year-old crime boss had just returned from a shopping trip with his wife Anna, their arms full of packages from the finest stores in the city. What Torrio didn't know was that two men had been waiting in the bitter cold for over an hour, their fingers numb around the triggers of their guns. As Torrio fumbled with his keys at the front door of his apartment building, the silence of the winter afternoon was about to be shattered by 5 gunshots that would change the course of American organized crime forever. The man who had built an empire was about to hand it over to his protégé, a young hothead named Al Capone. But this wasn't charity, and it wasn't loyalty. This was survival. You're about to discover one of the most shocking betrayals in criminal history, a story of mentorship turned deadly, and how 5 bullets on a snowy Chicago street led to the rise of America's most notorious gangster. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about how Al Capone really came to power. To understand how Johnny Torrio ended up bleeding in the snow, we need to go back to the beginning, to a world most Americans today can barely imagine. The year was 1920, and the United States had just passed the 18th Amendment, making the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal. What politicians thought would create a more moral America instead opened the floodgates to the greatest criminal opportunity in the nation's history. Chicago in the 1920s was a city of contradictions. Gleaming skyscrapers rose from streets thick with horse manure and automobile exhaust. Jazz music poured from speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors, while church bells rang from every neighborhood, calling the faithful to prayer. It was a city where millionaires and immigrants lived blocks apart, where corruption flowed as freely as the illegal liquor, and where violence was as common as the morning newspaper. Into this chaos stepped Johnny Torrio, a man who would revolutionize organized crime in America. Born in Italy but raised in New York, Torrio was unlike the thugs and street fighters who dominated Chicago's underworld. He was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, with wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a bookkeeper than a crime boss. And in many ways, that's exactly what he was. While other gangsters settled disputes with fists and bullets, Torrio preferred ledgers and negotiations. He saw prohibition not as a moral failing, but as a business opportunity beyond anyone's wildest dreams. When Torrio arrived in Chicago in 1920, the city's criminal landscape was a patchwork of small-time gangs fighting over scraps. Irish, Italian, Jewish, and Polish gangs controlled tiny territories, constantly at war with each other over gambling dens, brothels, and protection rackets. It was bloody, inefficient, and unprofitable. Torrio looked at this chaos and saw something different. He saw the foundation of an empire. But Torrio was smart enough to know he couldn't build this empire alone. He needed muscle, someone who could handle the violent side of the business, while he focused on strategy and organization. That's when he made a phone call that would echo through history.
He called his old friend from New York, a young man with a violent temper and an appetite for the spotlight. He called Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was everything Johnny Torrio wasn't. Where Torrio was quiet and thoughtful, Capone was loud and impulsive. Where Torrio dressed conservatively and avoided attention, Capone wore flashy suits and craved the spotlight. Where Torrio solved problems with his mind, Capone preferred his fists or a baseball bat. But Torrio saw something in the 21-year-old that others missed. Beneath Capone's brutal exterior was a sharp intelligence and a natural understanding of human psychology. More importantly, Capone was loyal, at least in the beginning. When Capone arrived in Chicago in 1921, Torrio put him to work immediately, not as a boss, but as muscle, as an enforcer who could handle the dirty work while Torrio built his vision of organized crime.
And what a vision it was! Instead of fighting over territories, Torrio proposed something revolutionary: cooperation. He began reaching out to rival gangs, not with threats, but with business propositions. Why fight over a few city blocks when they could divide the entire city and make everyone rich? The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Chicago would be carved up into territories, with each gang controlling their own area and paying a percentage to Torrio's organization for coordination and protection. Disputes would be settled through negotiation, not violence. The police would be bought and paid for, ensuring that business could operate smoothly. And at the center of it all would be Johnny Torrio, the quiet mastermind who turned chaos into profit. For 3 years, the plan worked better than anyone could have imagined. Money poured in from speakeasies, breweries, and distilleries. Torrio's organization grew from a small gang to a sophisticated criminal enterprise with hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in annual revenue. Police captains became business partners, judges took their cut, and politicians looked the other way as long as the money kept flowing. Johnny Torrio had achieved what no American criminal had ever accomplished. He had turned crime into a legitimate business. That success bred jealousy, and not everyone was happy with Torrio's peaceful approach to organized crime. The most vocal opponent was Dion O'Banion, the leader of the North Side Gang, and a man who seemed to thrive on violence and chaos. O'Banion was everything the new Chicago underworld was supposed to have left behind: unpredictable, violent, and completely uninterested in Torrio's vision of cooperation. The tension between Torrio and O'Banion had been building for months. O'Banion resented having to pay tribute to Torrio's organization and chafed under the restrictions of the territory agreements. He began making moves into areas controlled by Torrio's allies, hijacking their shipments and muscling in on their operations. When Torrio tried to negotiate, O'Banion responded with insults and threats. The breaking point came in May 1924, when O'Banion set up an elaborate trap that cost Torrio's organization hundreds of thousands of dollars and resulted in several key allies being arrested. It was a brilliant move that caught Torrio completely off guard and made him look weak in front of his partners. For a man who had built his reputation on being always one step ahead, this public humiliation was intolerable. What nobody knew was that O'Banion had made a fatal miscalculation.
He had assumed that Torrio was too civilized, too refined, to resort to the old ways of settling disputes. He thought the little man with the wire-rimmed glasses had gone soft. He was wrong. On November 10, 1924, Dion O'Banion was arranging flowers in his shop on North State Street when 3 men walked through the front door. O'Banion knew all 3 by sight, men who had done business with him in the past. As he reached out to shake hands with the first man, the other 2 pulled out guns and fired 6 shots into O'Banion's body. He was dead before he hit the floor, his blood mixing with the water from the overturned flower vases. The murder of Dion O'Banion sent shockwaves through Chicago's underworld. The era of peaceful cooperation was over, and everyone knew it. But what surprised many was how Al Capone reacted to the news.
While Torrio seemed almost regretful about the necessity of violence, Capone was energized by it. He saw O'Banion's death not as a tragic end to a promising experiment in organized crime, but as proof that the old ways still had their place. Violence, Capone believed, was just another tool in the business toolkit. The O'Banion murder marked the beginning of a bloody gang war that would consume Chicago for the next several years. O'Banion's lieutenants, Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, swore vengeance against Torrio and his organization. They began planning their revenge with the patience and precision of military strategists, studying Torrio's habits, mapping his routes, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Throughout 1924, the violence escalated. Torrio's men were gunned down in the street. O'Banion's allies retaliated by bombing Torrio-controlled speakeasies. The newspapers, which had once treated the gangsters as colorful characters in the city's ongoing drama, began calling it a war. And at the center of it all was the growing tension between mentor and student, between Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. Capone was thriving in the violent atmosphere. While Torrio seemed worn down by the constant threat of death, Capone appeared energized by it. He began taking more initiative, making decisions without consulting his boss, and building his own network of loyal followers within the organization. Torrio, focused on the immediate threat from O'Banion's successors, failed to notice that his own protégé was slowly positioning himself to take over.
The winter of 1924 was brutal in Chicago, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow piling up in the streets. But the cold didn't slow down the gang war. If anything, it seemed to intensify the violence, as if the brutal weather matched the brutal mood of the city's criminals. Torrio knew that Weiss and Moran were planning something big. His informants had told him about meetings, about weapons being stockpiled, about strangers asking questions in his neighborhood. But Torrio was confident in his security arrangements. He varied his routes, traveled with bodyguards, and never followed a predictable schedule. But here's where it gets interesting. On January 24th, 1925, Torrio made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. He dismissed his bodyguards and went shopping with his wife, alone and unprotected. Some historians believe he was simply tired of living like a prisoner in his own city. Others think he was testing his enemies, trying to draw them into the open where he could deal with them permanently.
But there's a third theory, one that's more disturbing and more believable than either of the others. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible untold stories. And stick around, because what happens next is absolutely wild. What if Johnny Torrio knew exactly what was going to happen that cold January afternoon? What if the man who had built his reputation on being always one step ahead had planned his own shooting? It sounds impossible, but consider the evidence. Torrio was a master strategist who never made impulsive decisions. Yet, on January 24th, he abandoned every security protocol he had established. He went to the same stores he always visited, following the same route he always took, at the same time he always shopped. For a man who had survived years of gang warfare by being unpredictable, this behavior was completely out of character. The shooting itself was almost theatrical in its execution. As Torrio fumbled with his keys at the entrance to his apartment building, two men emerged from behind a parked car. The first gunman, later identified as Jaime Weiss, approached from the left, while the second, George Moran, came from the right. They were both excellent marksmen, men who had killed before with single, precise shots. Yet when they opened fire on Johnny Torrio from less than 10 feet away, something went wrong. The first bullet caught Torrio in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the door of his building. The second bullet hit him in the arm, shattering bone and sending blood spattering across the fresh snow. The third bullet missed entirely, embedding itself in the brick wall behind him. The fourth bullet hit him in the leg, dropping him to his knees. The fifth and final bullet grazed his neck, leaving a bloody groove but missing the major arteries that would have killed him instantly. Now you might be thinking that Torrio was just incredibly lucky to survive such a brutal attack, but here's what makes the whole thing suspicious. Both Weiss and Moran were known for their marksmanship. These weren't panicked amateurs spraying bullets wildly. They were professional killers who had executed dozens of hits with cold precision. Yet when they had their greatest enemy completely helpless, when they had the chance to end the gang war with 5 perfectly placed shots, they somehow managed to miss every vital organ. As Torrio lay bleeding in the snow, something even stranger happened. Instead of finishing him off, instead of putting a final bullet in his head to make sure the job was done, Weiss and Moran simply walked away. They climbed into their car and drove off, leaving their greatest enemy alive and breathing. When the police arrived, they found Torrio conscious and coherent, his wounds serious but not life-threatening. The newspapers called it a miracle. The police called it sloppy work. But Al Capone, who arrived at the hospital within an hour of the shooting, called it an opportunity. While Torrio lay recovering in his hospital bed, Capone took control of the organization with a speed and efficiency that suggested he had been preparing for this moment for months. He met with the key lieutenants, reassured the allies, and made it clear that business would continue as usual under his leadership. When reporters asked about Torrio's condition, Capone expressed concern and loyalty. But privately, he was already making plans for a future that didn't include his former mentor. The official story was that Torrio's injuries were so severe that he could no longer handle the stress and danger of running a criminal empire. The doctors said the trauma had affected his nerves, that he jumped at loud noises and couldn't sleep without nightmares. His wife Anna begged him to retire, to take the money they had saved and start over somewhere safe. And after weeks of deliberation, Torrio announced that he was stepping down as head of the organization and turning control over to Al Capone. But what if the official story was a carefully constructed lie? What if Johnny Torrio, the master strategist, had orchestrated his own shooting as part of an elaborate exit strategy?
Think about it from his perspective. By early 1925, the gang war was spiraling out of control. The violence was attracting unwanted attention from federal authorities. The profits were being eaten up by security costs and legal fees. And most importantly, Torrio could see that Al Capone was growing more powerful and more independent every day. Torrio was smart enough to know that Capone would eventually make his own move for control. The question wasn't if, but when. And when that moment came, Torrio would face a terrible choice: fight his own protégé in a war that would destroy everything he had built, or find a way to step aside gracefully while keeping his life and his fortune intact. The shooting gave him the perfect excuse. He could retire with honor, claiming that his injuries prevented him from continuing.
He could turn the organization over to Capone without appearing weak or defeated. And most importantly, he could leave Chicago with his reputation intact and his bank accounts full. Within weeks of the shooting, Torrio began making arrangements to leave the city. He sold his interests in various criminal enterprises to Capone at what appeared to be below market prices. He transferred control of key operations and introduced Capone to important contacts in other cities. To outside observers, it looked like a generous mentor helping his successor. But the more cynical interpretation is that Torrio was being paid handsomely for his cooperation in his own retirement. The final piece of evidence for this theory comes from what happened next. If Weiss and Moran had really tried to kill Torrio, if they had really failed in their assassination attempt, they would have tried again.
Torrio was vulnerable in the hospital, then vulnerable during his recovery at home. There would have been dozens of opportunities to finish the job, yet no further attempts were made on his life. It was as if the North Side gang was satisfied that their point had been made, that justice had been served with 5 bullets and a public humiliation. By the spring of 1925, the transformation was complete. Johnny Torrio, the quiet mastermind who had revolutionized organized crime in America, was preparing to leave Chicago forever. Al Capone, the loud and violent protégé, was now the undisputed boss of the most powerful criminal organization in the country. The changing of the guard had happened so smoothly, so efficiently, that most people didn't even realize it had occurred. But Capone wasn't content to simply maintain what Torrio had built.
Where his mentor had preferred negotiation and compromise, Capone believed in intimidation and force. Where Torrio had tried to keep a low profile, Capone courted publicity and fame. Where Torrio had seen crime as a business, Capone saw it as a way of life. The differences became apparent almost immediately. Under Torrio's leadership, gang violence had been strategic and limited. Under Capone, it became spectacular and public. The St. Valentine's Day massacre, the bombing of rival speakeasies, the corruption of entire police departments, all of these became hallmarks of the Capone era. The quiet revolution that Torrio had started became a loud and bloody spectacle under his successor. And Johnny Torrio watched it all from a safe distance. He had taken his money and moved to Italy, where he lived comfortably for the rest of his life. He never returned to Chicago, never tried to reclaim his empire, never even publicly criticized the man who had taken his place. When reporters tracked him down years later and asked about his time as a crime boss, Torrio claimed he had simply been a businessman who got caught up in circumstances beyond his control. But those who knew him best weren't fooled by his modest protestations. They knew that Johnny Torrio had accomplished something that no other crime boss in American history had managed. He had built an empire, ruled it successfully for years, and then walked away from it on his own terms. The 5 bullets that nearly killed him had actually saved his life,
giving him the perfect excuse to escape before the violence and publicity that would eventually destroy so many of his contemporaries. The irony is that Torrio's greatest success might have been his apparent failure.
By appearing to be the victim of a botched assassination attempt, he managed to avoid the fate that befell almost every other major figure from the Prohibition era. Al Capone died of syphilis in prison. Jaime Weiss was gunned down in the street. Bugs Moran ended up as a petty criminal, dying in poverty and obscurity. But Johnny Torrio lived to be 75 years old, dying peacefully in his bed, surrounded by his family. The question that historians still debate is whether Torrio planned it all from the beginning. Did he know, even as he was building his empire, that he would need an exit strategy? Did he groom Al Capone not just as muscle and a lieutenant, but as his eventual replacement? Did he orchestrate his own shooting as the perfect way to transfer power while preserving his own life? We may never know the truth for certain.
But what we do know is that Johnny Torrio was one of the smartest criminal minds in American history, a man who turned chaos into order and violence into profit. If anyone could have planned such an elaborate deception, it would have been him. And if he did plan it, then the 5 bullets that nearly killed him on that snowy January afternoon weren't a failure at all. They were the final, brilliant move in a game that he had been playing all along. The legacy of that shooting extends far beyond the personal fortunes of Torrio and Capone. It marked the end of one era of organized crime and the beginning of another. Torrio's model of cooperation and negotiation gave way to Capone's style of intimidation and spectacle. The quiet businessman was replaced by the celebrity gangster. And in many ways, American organized crime never recovered from that transition. Under Torrio's leadership, the Chicago outfit had been efficient and profitable, but it had also been sustainable. By keeping violence to a minimum and maintaining good relationships with corrupt officials, Torrio had created a system that could have lasted for decades. But Capone's approach, while more dramatic and certainly more famous, was ultimately self-destructive. The constant violence attracted federal attention. The public spectacle made it impossible for politicians to look the other way, and the personality cult that Capone built around himself made him a target that law enforcement couldn't ignore. If this story amazed you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're bringing you these deep dives into history's most fascinating moments every single week. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Do you think Johnny Torrio planned his own shooting, or was he really just lucky to survive? What would you have done in his position? And next week, we're covering the incredible story of how a single photograph brought down one of the most powerful crime families in New York. You won't want to miss it.